When you're in the middle of battle, and particularly a drawn-out battle, and your riflemen start to run low on ammunition, one of the options to you is to start taking linked ammo for your machine gun and distributing that across your squad and platoon, or vice versa. It can be that the machine gun is running low and you start taking rounds from the riflemen and literally putting it back into a link and getting that to your machine guns. What is the single cartridge platoon, and why is that so important even today? That's what we're going to discuss next. I'm Dr. Christopher Larsen, a veteran of the U.S. Army Infantry, founder of One Shepherd Leadership Institute, and author of Small Unit Tactical Doctrine. In the last video, we discussed the squad automatic weapon, and I talked about a little bit of the history of where it came from in World War I, and how it emerged, and that doctrine really matured through World War II and Korea. Now, it's interesting because I think there was another reason for its success. While the U.S. Platoons still had a very integrated and far from a single cartridge platoon, that is, that their SMGs, their submachine guns, whether that was the Thompson or the M3 grease gun, they were firing .45 caliber. Your M1 and subsequent full auto M2 carbines were firing a .30 caliber carbine cartridge. Neither of those were compatible with the main rifle, the M1 Garand, the BAR, and your M1919 machine guns. They all, thankfully, fired a .30-06 round. So it wasn't completely alleviated of the single cartridge logistics, that is, not all the weapon systems could share, but thankfully most of them could. Well, what happens in 1957 is that the United States military moves away from the .30-06 cartridge and moves into the M14. When we did that, the BAR went away. So did the M1919. The M60 is introduced because the M60 fires the same 7.62 by 51 millimeter cartridge as the M1A M14. And in fact, anecdotally, my father entered the U.S. Army in 1957, catching the tail end of what was then called the Brown Boot Army, and it was a fundamental shift. But he wrote home that while he was going through basic with an M1 Garand, once he got to his permanent party station, he was issued an M1A. And that's what he called it, an M1A. It really wasn't known as an M14 until the very, very early 1960s. And an M14 is, in fact, a different weapon system for only one reason. And that is that they put a little selector in there to go from semi-auto. The M1A is semi-auto. And this allowed the M14 to select a full auto fire. And that was going to replace the BAR, at least initially. Well, it didn't. The M14 and M16 failed miserably in this regard. They never really replaced the squad automatic rifle for many of the reasons that we've discussed earlier. That is, in very simple terms, that they could still be assigned the same target priority as a previous BAR gunner would have been, but now they had a weapon that was rather inferior in that role. It was inferior in many different ways. Let's look at the M14. It's a beloved rifle, and I don't mean to, again, to diminish its contributions and those that love it, but it was a beloved M1A rifle. As an M14 squad automatic rifle, it failed. A rifle wants to hit its target. I mean, that's its purpose. Hit your target, okay? And we're talking one shot, one hit on the target. Precision is following that up with a hole in the target very near the other hole. And this allows a precision whereby you can actually select which part of the target you wish to hit, rather than merely hitting the target. So precision and accuracy are somewhat different. They're a nuanced difference, but it's an important difference. An automatic rifle isn't concerned with either of those. It is, in that regard, more similar to the machine gun. And what I mean here is that it fires a cone of fire. That's something I'm not going to go into detail right now, but the cone of fire is a pattern on the ground, on the target area, And that's what becomes very important. It's a very broad pattern. The M14 was not controllable in full auto fire and fired an unsatisfactory, very large cone of fire. It wasn't tight enough to have the intended effect on the target. And so in this way I say it was disappointing, and it never really served well in that capacity as an automatic rifle. So the United States Army and eventually the United States Marine Corps, their solution was to go ahead and issue every single rifleman that switch and move the M1A out of service and the M14 into service. I think this was a horrible mistake. And the M16, by the way, really for the most part far more controllable, but still fails in that regard. It just doesn't serve well as an auto rifle. Colt comes out with the Colt Lsw light support weapon to address that situation with a heavier barrel and several other features, and in fact it was adopted by several countries, not the least of which was Canada and I believe the Netherlands. So it had some success in that role. The British, and they start building in the 1970s the L85, and they come up with their own solution for a light support weapon, automatic rifle, in the L86 LSW. You have that bit of history there. But it's interesting going back to the 1950s when we had close to a single cartridge platoon, and we really haven't since then. Our machine guns, once we went to the M16, our rifles fired 5.56 millimeter, and our machine guns fired 7.62 by 51, and and other variations in there. So we've struggled with this. And in 1957, there was a conversation among NATO, and the conversation was specifically led by the British Army and the British Defense. And they suggested that we needed to go to a single cartridge platoon, and their recommendation of the all-around best cartridge for that would be somewhere around a 6.5 millimeter 28 caliber. The United States Army notoriously disagreed, and we wound up with going with a 7.62, basically a 7.5 millimeter, where the Brits were requiring and recommending a 6.5 millimeter. And as we all know, within less than 10 years, less than a decade later, we went with the United States military went with a 5.5 millimeter, the 223 5.56. Nonetheless, the argument was for logistical reasons, for tactical reasons, it would be the optimal outcome for us to have a single cartridge platoon. That is, the machine gun fires the same caliber and cartridge as the squad automatic rifle. The squad automatic rifle fires the same caliber and cartridge as the designated marksman rifle and the rifle carbines issued to riflemen. And that would be optimal because they could all share when things, got tight in an elongated, drawn-out battle. It makes logistical sense. It's logical. The question then, of course, was which cartridge is best. We Americans went with 7.5 millimeter. Shunning the British recommendation, and all these years later, and then eventually adapt a 5.5 millimeter, and God knows the 5.56 has a wonderful performance in regards to, frankly, in regards to accuracy, but also in terminal ballistics into soft targets, that is soft material, flesh material. It really performs admirably. In fact, I think it outperforms many of the heavier rounds. And I think that's part of the reasons it has stuck around so long. But nonetheless, we really are looking for an optimal cartridge that can hit hard targets effectively, carry energy greater distances, say for the machine guns and the DMRs, but also do that wonderful thing where it yaws and then fragments in short material. And in its ballistic, termination. So here's the thing about that. If you look, I'm going to make an assertion here, it's a little brazen, but if you look at the last 40 years, I'm going to say since the Glock pistol came out in the 1980s, we really haven't had any innovations in firearms. There have been some great promise that the military then tests and says, wow, this one's really as good as our AR-15. I mean, this is performing toe-to-toe with the M16 or the M4 carbine or whatever it is. Toe-to-toe, not better. There has not been a significantly better rifle made. And I know that'll upset people, and you don't have to agree. You're certainly free to disagree with that. But I think we would agree that the great preponderance of innovation in firearms has really been in ammunition over the last 40 years. And I think this gives rise to, okay, can we now have that single cartridge platoon and squad? And I think the answer is yes. My vote, for what it's worth, would be right now for the 6.5 Grindle. I'm not saying the 6.8 series SPC underperforms. I just like at farther distances the 6.5 Grindle. I think it outperforms both the 6.8 and the 7.62 at distances, say 600, 800, 1,000 meters. They perform about the same up to the quarter mile of 400 meters and in. There's not a huge difference there. I have to admit that Hornady's and the industry backing Hornady's release of the 6mm arc is intriguing, and so that might be instead a better option. It takes some investigation here, but here's what I'm trying to say. If you can imagine, let's say for sake of an argument, we wind up going with the 6.5 Grindle. If you use a very, very light bullet, that is, I'm saying somewhere down around maybe 90, 95 grains, and to gain that really high speed for carbines and rifles so that the bullet, when it hits soft tissue, yaws and fragments quickly, you've got that wonderful effect, a very similar effect, and a whole lot more energy than the 223 5.56. You've retained that. At the same time, if you go with heavier rounds for, say, DMR and machine guns, you can get greater accuracy farther and farther out. Not just greater accuracy, but greater energy into the target than, say, a 5.56. If you're willing to put in steel penetrator rounds or something like this into the bullet, you get even better performance and penetration of hard targets such as bunkers, soft-skinned vehicles, and even thick-skinned vehicles. And yet, while each round then is optimized for each one of those weapon systems, optimized for performance, the bullet itself fits in each of the weapon systems, meaning that they can share. Will they still retain the optimal performance? No. If machine gun ammunition is sharing with a carbine, it probably will not maintain its optimal performance, but it isn't like the thing's spinning sideways out there. It's shooting, very functionally and very safely out of that firearm in a pinch. And so I think that's really where this goes. Now, I recognize that people say, wow, that in and of itself could be a logistical nightmare because, if you're looking at 3 or 4 different cartridge variations for a platoon, then why not just have different calibers and cartridges? And here again, the answer is because they can't share across weapon systems. And so I think this is actually possibly the solution as we move forward. Let's leverage the technological innovation we've had, which is in ammunition, and let's seek that one cartridge, single cartridge platoon.